Hi class, today we're going to be looking at the introduction to the cell, looking at the history of the cell. And you can see here the three questions we're going to try and cover today. Describe the three parts of the cell theory, explain how cells are diverse in shape and size, why is cell shape important to its function, and explain why cell surface area to volume ratio is important for cell function. So the introduction to the cell, we're going to look at structure and function of the cell and kind of the discovery of the cell. And this is chapter 4, the beginning of chapter 4. So first, discovering the cell. In 1665, Robert Hooke looked at a plant under the microscope and he saw little boxes. And he called these little boxes cells. These were cork cells, so they were actually dead cells and just empty spaces, and that's why he called them cells, thinking of like a jail cell being an empty space. And so we didn't actually know anything about the inside of the cell, just seeing these empty spaces in a cork. In 1673, the next scientist, Van Leeuwenhoek, he was the first to see living cells. And so really this came about with the invention or discovery of the microscope. Without the microscope, we would not have been able to see cells. So we go forward about 150 years, and we have three scientists we're looking at here, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow. And these led into the cell theory. So Schleiden said that all plants are composed of cells. Schwann said that all animals are composed of cells, and Virchow said cells can only come from other cells. And this last part here might seem like it's not really that important. I mean, obviously living things come from other living things. But at the time, this concept of cells coming only from other cells was a pretty big concept. People often thought of that living things could come out of non-living things through spontaneous generation. And so to come out and say that really was a bold statement at the time. These other two scientists, Schleiden and Schwann, had done experiments to discover these and had, made their own hypotheses, looked at many different plants, many different animals, and were able to give these statements that all living things are composed of cells. So this will lead us into the cell theory. And the cell theory has three parts. All living things are composed of cells. Cells are the basic unit of an organism, so they have the DNA and the structure that's inside that cell allows for the living thing. And cells only come from reproduction of pre-existing cells. Now this part here with cells are the basic unit of an organism, we can know that because there's unicellular organisms like bacteria, and they have all that they need to function. So a cell itself, one individual cell, can function alone if it's a unicellular organism. Other organisms that are multicellular have many different types of cells that are all differentiated to do their specific job and allow the living thing to survive. And then the cells come from pre-existing cells. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get in the evolution section about spontaneous generation versus biogenesis. But the word here that you might see, and especially will later on in other chapters, is biogenesis. So living things come from other living things. So cells are very diverse in how they look and how they function. Cell diversity in our bodies, just to show you some examples, red blood cells, and notice they look very different from bacterial cells. So our red blood cells have this circular shape, kind of look like a little donut almost when they carry oxygen. And notice that there's some that have different shapes to them. Some look a little bit more full and round, and we'll get to that in chapter 5 why that is. And some have this little kind of donut shape look. And then bacterial cells can be a variety of different looks, but notice these are rod-shaped bacterial cells. These cells here, these are computer-generated but ulcer-causing bacteria cells, and notice they have these little hairs that come off the end to allow them to project and move. And then a parasitic cell, which looks even a little bit different. So cells can be a variety of shapes, and a variety of functions go along with those shapes. Our body has over 200 different types of cells. Let's show you kind of some examples of what those look like. All right, and then if we look at cell size, cells are microscopic. And you can see here just kind of an example of different types of cells and what you can use to see them. So a light microscope allows you to see plant cells and animal cells, which we will be doing in lab later on. Bacteria, some of them can be seen with a light microscope, and then even smaller things like molecules and viruses need an electron microscope to see those. So overall, cells are microscopic. There are some plant cells you might be able to see without a light microscope, at least the outline of them. But overall, we need a microscope. So the tool of a microscope allowed us to begin seeing cells. Without this invention, we couldn't see cells, and we didn't realize that what they were, or what they, how they existed, and all of those things. So when we look at cells and how they function, volume and surface area ratio are extremely important. So everything the cell needs or has to get rid of must go through the cell membrane. And we're going to talk about this in Chapter 5. The cell membrane is very important. We're going to get to it more in Chapter 5. But everything that has to go in and out of the cell has to pass through the cell membrane. There's not like a door. The cell membrane is kind of a gate that it has to go through. So the cell membrane allowing things to go in and out is related to its surface area. The surface area of a cell is related to this cell membrane. The amount of food and waste that must pass the cell membrane is related to its volume. So the amount is related to the volume or space that's inside. If a cell gets too big, the surface area is insufficient to meet the demands of the cell's volume, and the cell will stop growing. So if the cell gets really, really large, there's not enough surface area to allow food to go in and out, or to allow stuff to go in and out of the cell. So the cell has a specific ratio that it needs to keep. Cells have to stay fairly small in order for there to be enough surface area for stuff to go in and out of the cell. You can practice this in a lab assignment. It'll be a choice assignment, so if you choose that one, you may do that and practice kind of looking at the different sizes of a box and being able to see how surface area changes based on the size of that particular cell. So if we were to actually look at this, your surface area is length times width times the number of sides. Volume is length times width times height. And the ratio is surface area to volume. Again, you can practice this in a lab assignment. So some adaptations to animals. Bird eggs and frog eggs have an extra storage of food, so they can rapidly divide to produce multi-celled embryos. So the eggs themselves have like this extra pocket of food, and then they allow that all those cells to rapidly divide, quickly produce the embryos. And the second adaptation, make the cell long and thin or skinny and flat. A thin cell will maintain a small volume but has a large increase in surface area because it's so flat. So that will allow the cell to be adapted to being able to take in more food or more stuff that it needs. Okay, and then our last little part here is cell shape and function. So the shape of a cell will determine the function of the cell. If a cell is really large and flat, kind of like your skin cells, it's used to cover a living organism. Something like red blood cells, they're circular and they have this ability to fit into tiny little capillaries. They can then expand a little bit and go through larger blood vessels. So the shape of them is very important. If we were to have a red blood cell, so if this is our red blood cell here and it's circular, and we have something called sickle cell anemia, what will happen is you'll end up with this cell that looks like a sickle shape. And this type of cell can get stuck in the tiny little capillaries. And so if it gets stuck here in these spots, then you'll see that you have a backup of other cells behind it, and that'll be a blood clot. So our cell shape is very important to the function that it's going to have. Another example would be something like these little guys right here. These are like little white blood cells, and they want to attach to virus or bacteria. And as they do that, you can see that they have these like rigid edges, and they will attach to a bacteria or a virus to try and eat it up or kill it, basically. So the shape is very important to its function. Okay, and that is the end of this set of notes. This is section 1 of chapter 4. And again, a couple things that you definitely need to know are is the cell theory, why cell shape matters, why volume and surface area matter, and looking over function. Just have an idea of how cells function and why they look different or why they act different based on their function.